Our first panel is a panel discussion among funders, and we are very fortunate to have three representatives from three different types of funding organizations: a small private foundation, a large private foundation, and a large federal funder. And they each have comments of their own in reflection, reaction, context of the Metascience meeting. They'll each speak for 5 minutes about their own thoughts that are relevant to our discussion. And then they'll break into conversation among themselves for some period of time. And then once that has raised a lot of the issues that they want to get onto the table for us, we will open up to Q&A and interactive discussion for the rest of the session. So let me introduce all three of them and then have them take it away with their conversation and individual points. So first, Dawid Potgieter is a senior program officer from the Templeton World Charity Foundation. Arthur Lupia, goes by Skip, is assistant director of the National Science Foundation. And Chonnettia Jones is Director of Insight and Analysis at the Wellcome Trust. So please join me in welcoming them, and Dawid, please stay.
Well, thank you, Brian. And I'm going to start by answering a question that people have asked me a lot, which is, why on earth is there more than one Templeton Foundation? And what are you doing in the Bahamas? As some of you may know, John Templeton lived in the Bahamas for 40 years, and when he died in 2008, his money actually went to 3 organizations. So we're not the same as the John Templeton Foundation, although I've enjoyed learning from my colleagues there as we support the Center for Open Science. My own background is in neuroscience. I'm currently working on a portfolio where we try to promote adversarial collaboration. And the way we do that is by enforcing open science mechanisms. We get people to play fair. People who wouldn't normally work together, we give them money only if they do, but it's got to be a pre-registration, and there's got to be a replication, and so on. Something that I hope we can discuss a bit further comes from this idea that we've had some great talks, lots of suggested ways that the field can change, lots of suggestions that funders should lead the way, and I think it's good funders should lead the way because they apply this selection pressure. But I think there hasn't been very much said about how to change things. So I work in a pretty small organization. We can change things relatively quickly, but still it's hard. And I think the bigger the organization, it's sort of exponentially more difficult to change stuff. So one of the things I'm interested in at the moment is just finding out what's the low-hanging fruit, how should things change, and we've actually commissioned COS to do a survey of the field to see what other funders are doing. And I hope that as a small foundation, we can make some changes quite quickly, try out some suggestions for how to improve the quality of science. And maybe that could be helpful to others. But really, I mention all that to say that I don't think there will be very much change unless if we have this kind of research, this field of metascience, because funders, and you should correct me if I'm wrong, but we're very bureaucratic. And we're very scared of messing things up. And so having some kind of solid evidence to make a change really is immensely valuable. And I think that's why I'm so glad to be at a meeting like this where people are gathering that evidence.
Hello. Thank you for being here. So it is Sunday morning in the United States of America. And there are few higher callings for people on a Sunday morning than to contemplate how to make science better today than it was yesterday. What you are doing, what you've seen, is part of an incredible phenomenon. It is inspirational. I think, I'm watching people inspire each other, but having observed, what we called open science, what other people call research on research, it's inspiring so many people around the world, particularly young scholars who have all the motivation to tear apart the foundations of science and rebuild them in a way that constitutes a more effective and higher form of service. What motivates me and a lot of my colleagues at the National Science Foundation is what's at the end of a scientific workflow. And I don't mean the publications. I mean the impact that the work has. There are the glorified stories of how the science that we do stimulates the entrepreneurs and changes the economy. There are the real stories of how the work that we do helps the first responders and the people who take care of health and the people who secure neighborhoods, and how it helps them do their job more effectively and efficiently. And those are all really important aspects of science. What I think about a lot, and what gets me through the tougher days of being a funder, are the people who will never step foot on a college campus or know what an academic conference is. There are millions of them around the world who face a variety of challenges and opportunities. Many people struggle to get through the day. Some of us have worked in different parts of the world, and it is easier than you think to see horrible things at scale. And what is amazing is the number of cases where scientific research done in particular ways can transform people's quality of life, people who we will never meet. And it's really, it's an incredible thing to witness. So there is nothing more important for these people, for these causes, than getting it right, than us getting what we do right. And what we're talking about here is such a critical part of that. In my view, at NSF, I get to see a lot of science. At NSF, we cover a wide range of things. I believe that this enterprise, that this conversation, is the most important thing happening in science today. Because if we don't get this right, what's the value of the rest of it? Right? And we've had that inquiry. But again, I think of it not just in terms of publications and things of that nature. The people at the end of our workflows, I assure you, are real. And as I mentioned the other day, for many of them, we are their last best hope. So that's worth fighting for. At NSF, we are working to support these types of things, this type of research, more energetically and more rigorously. So I want to tell you about an announcement that we've made publicly, but we'll make it more rigorously in the next month. We're standing up 3 programs that will be relevant to people working in this area. We have a program called SciSip that some of you may know. We are trying to make it more focused on supporting this type of work. So starting in October, that program will have a new name. It's Science of Science. What's important is what happens. There's a colon. I don't love the semicolon, but there it is. 3 focuses: discovery, communication, and impact. If you study those things, if you want to know how to improve them, discovery, the workflow, how we take human beings and materials and turn them into insights, that's what we want to fund. Communication, how we take the things that we discover and turn them into accurate, usable memories by other human beings. And then impact, why it matters. And a key part of this program is we not only want work on this topic, we want everybody to walk the walk when it comes to how do we evaluate whether this is going on. So that's a top line. We have another program. We have a program now called Cultivating Cultures of Ethics in STEM. It's an amazing program, but very few of you know about it. We are increasing its visibility and support, and it will be called Ethical and Responsible Research, and it is to fund basic research on this topic. Right? We are also, we'll have a program that will evolve through the next year called Human Networks and Data Science. If you have a theoretical foundation and a real question, and you need a lot of data to deal with that, this program will help you do that. So those are some programs that you should know about. The other thing I want to talk about just in the context of open science is a conversation we're having. It's very exciting, both at NSF and throughout the federal government. Right now, NSF has a public access repository. So we fund non-classified research. So if you get NSF money and you get a publication out of it or a journaled conference, a refereed conference paper, It has to go in the public access repository, right now with a 12-month embargo. We're talking about a next generation of this, where we use persistent DOIs, we use metadata, we use machine-readable DMPs, and a linkage structure to create, think about this possibility. You go to the NSF website and you look up an award. Suppose you could see the title of the award, the abstract, links to all the publications, links to the data, links to the materials, links to the DMP, links to the machine-readable DMP that's versioned, right? What would that be like, right, if you could get to it very quickly? And now, here's the pipe dream. Imagine that government agencies could coordinate enough on metadata standards, on DMP, how you might lay it out. Maybe you'd have a single portal where you could search and you could find all the work done in an area from a number of government agencies using the metadata and the persistent linkages to find all of that. That could be a game changer if we pull it off, and it has a great financial consequence for the federal government. You don't have 22 agencies trying to build their own data fortresses, which is a complete pain. Just that's a technical term. The other thing that we are working on in this field is partnerships. So at NSF, we have a basic value. There's 4 assets that we have at NSF. We have tremendous brand equity, people like us. We have a license from Congress to fund basic research, fundamental research, that doesn't have to lead to a product right away. Many other people with money have to fund things that lead to an object quickly. We don't. We have a peer review system that has a lot of good attributes, particularly compared to other ways of making decisions about research funding. And then we have a well-informed network into every research university in this country. So we have those assets. And there are other organizations that have different emphases, but complementary assets. We are looking for ways to work with them so we can take the opportunity that we have and empower others to produce really amazing insights and instruments and so forth. And we want to be active in this space. So here's the thing I want to leave you with. By some measures, this should be the golden age of science. If you think about the rigor that is growing in so many areas, if you think about the growing diversity of the scientific workforce, we still have a lot of work to do, but we're better today than at any previous point in history. And if you think about an effort like this, the opportunity for the golden age of science is right in front of us, but it isn't obvious. It's not automatic. So when I think about this topic, the belief that I have is the next step in this is not about somebody else. It's about us, and it's not about tomorrow, it's about today. And that's what we have to wake up every day knowing. We have to find the urgency in every day to try and do better tomorrow than we did today. And I look forward to working with all of you on that.
Okay. So good morning. Just so delighted that all of you got up on Sunday morning to be here. I'm here from London. You'll probably be able to tell from my accent, I am American. So I can relate to some of the conversations here, but I am here representing an organization founded in London. I'm not here alone. I've got my colleagues, and I'm going to embarrass them by pointing them out. The question for me that I'd like to reflect on is why did we come all this way? Why am I spending this Sunday morning here with you? And this conference is so timely. So I just really want to congratulate Brian and colleagues and the organizers for doing this, because this is amazing. And the work that we've heard about over the last several days has just been fantastic. The reason why I'm here is because of this observation, or well, really this data point. There are reports that estimate that $2 trillion are spent on research and development around the world. $2 trillion. And what's really remarkable about a $2 trillion enterprise is that we actually don't know how it works, what works, and how to make it work better. And that is just remarkable to me. If you'll indulge me, I'm going to share with you just a little bit of insight from a report that was generated by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. This was put out in 2018. And they did a review of 75 different competitive funding schemes from 21 different countries. Most of, as we know, funding is actually distributed through competitive mechanisms. And we also are aware of, because we feel it, that there are budgetary pressures. They're forcing funders to respond differently. And one of the ways that we respond differently is by creating specific priorities, and those priorities really look different from funder to funder. There are a lot of really advantageous reasons for having competitive funding. But what we do know, and this report really highlights this really well, is that what we're seeing is trends that are really worrisome. The report highlights that we're seeing favoring short-term, lower-risk projects rather than longer-term, higher-risk research. We've heard about that in the last couple of days. We're seeing that there's an increased burden put on individuals for both applying for and reviewing grants. Again, we've heard about that in the last couple of days. We've also know that institutions and individuals are having difficulty planning long-term because of uncertain future funding. So in light of this, what's really remarkable, and I think what's happening, is that the degree of competition and the overall productivity of research and the strain being put on national research systems are really, really suffering. Okay, so there has to be consequences for that at a national level, at an institutional level, at an organizational level, at an individual level. There's no doubt. So I would absolutely agree with my colleagues that it is so urgent that we actually start to do research on the scientific enterprise. Now, I just want to point out a couple of things that came out of the report in terms of recommendations, because I think it was Steve yesterday who fairly challenged funders to hold ourselves accountable. And I am here representing a funder, and I'm willing to accept that challenge. OECD definitely picked up on this when they did their review. And I just want to quickly read the 3 recommendations that came through from them. The first is interested countries are invited to initiate further analytical and comparative studies on the true costs and benefits of competitive funding schemes. That was recommendation number 1. Recommendation number 2, research funders are encouraged to develop experiments in competitive funding, especially in easing the administrative burden, often linked to peer review, and for increasing efficiencies. And the third recommendation they made, there were several others, I forget how many pages, but certainly do read it. Governments and research funders are encouraged to experiment with approaches to competitive funding that preserve competition while still encouraging potentially transformative, breakthrough, and/or multidisciplinary approaches to guard against potential conservatism of research. We all know this. We've been talking about this. We feel this. And that's why meta-research is so important. So from a funder's perspective, the reason why meta-research is important, because by having that evidence, as Dawid just said, we can optimize the allocation of funding for research. We can maximize the impact of investments in research. We can justify further public investments in research. We can maintain the integrity of research. It informs science and research policy. And very importantly, evidence can be used to promote best practice and drive change. So I'm going to put forward a provocation that I'm hoping that my colleagues will engage with me. And I'm going to say this: if we're going to do research on the scientific process, then why would we not want to use that evidence to be able to improve the research enterprise? So not just doing meta-research for the sake of research, but for the purpose of actually translating that evidence, those insights, into change that benefits everyone. So Wellcome Trust, I haven't told you who we are. If you don't know, we're the 2nd largest private foundation in the world that funds biomedical research. We are based out of London, but we fund into 100 different countries. We spend about £1 billion a year. Nowhere near as much as the NSF, but we think we do our part. But we want to distribute our funding in the most efficient, fair, open, and inclusive ways possible. And to be able to do that, we want to know, how can we improve the way that we actually fund research? How can we improve our policies? How can we improve our support for the research community? And we want to do that in an evidence-based way. So I'm just going to tell you what we're actually doing and how we're going to respond to this. We actually went looking for the research evidence, because certainly you would imagine that there's research out there that we can act on. And the reality is, for the last 2 years, we've been hunting, and what we found is that there's little to no research evidence that could usefully inform funding practice and funding policy. A lot of amazing insights, as I've said in the last couple of days. But I would struggle with taking what I've heard in the last couple of days, going back to London and turning that into actually application. And the reason that is because of two things. One is that the current research that we can find, a funder can find, does come across as being very fragmented, not generalizable, and not actionable. And I know this is one of the motivations that Brian had in bringing the different communities together, because we really need a broader view of the research practice. And the second important reason is because what funders do, frankly, is a black box. We put our data out there, but really, frankly, no one knows. I couldn't speak to what Skip does or what Dawid does in terms of how they make their decisions, what happens when things don't get funded, and so on. And that matters. For meta research to actually usefully change funding policy and practice, it has to be able to do four things. You have to know context. You have to know the national context and the national priorities. You have to have complete funders data, not just what was approved, but what was rejected, what was declined, what were the reviewer comments, what were the scores, what were the panel really saying in that deliberation room. You have to have the counterfactuals, really clever ways that people are trying to get counterfactuals. And more importantly, perhaps, you have to experiment. You have to test. So the concept of applying the scientific method to research is actually pretty remarkable that we don't actually do that as funders. Now, having talked to 30 international funders around the world for the last 2 years, I am encouraged because funders do care. We do want the evidence, and we do want to participate. And that's really good news, and that's clearly evident by the reasons that we're here and the things that we're doing. Wellcome Trust at the end of the month, on September 30th, our response is that we're going to be launching a new Research on Research Institute. This is a partnership that is going to be co-funded by the Wellcome Trust, by the University of Sheffield in the UK, and with us is Professor James Wilston, who's sitting in the front row, and I'll probably embarrass him later. This will also be a partnership with Digital Science, a commercial partner who will be participating and providing in-kind contributions, so working outside of their normal commercial model, and CWTS Leiden University at Netherlands. And what will make this distinct from any other similar initiative is that it will be truly interdisciplinary. We will bring together funders, policymakers, academics, technologists, publishers, et cetera, to advance meta-research. It will be truly international. We will, at that time, also announce strategic partners. We have 15 major funders represented from 10 countries around the world, multi-billion-dollar investments by these funders who really are willing to participate. It will be truly collaborative. Funders will participate not as sponsors of the research, but as end users, as collaborators, to maximize the potential that those insights can actually change our practice. And lastly, it will be truly translational. Part of that will be the development of a new innovation space where funders will actually conduct primary research, be able to do experimentation in collaboration with researchers. So this will be a 2-year pilot. Definitely look forward to hearing the announcement, and what we hope is that many of you will be people that we will work with in the coming future. So I think I'll just end by saying, I think, like I said, this is so timely, and I think I would just like for us to challenge us to think about what evidence, what tools do we need to be able to do that, to be able to really change the way research practice can actually just benefit everybody.
Excellent. Fabulous. Thank you, all three of you. Yeah. So we will move to having them have just an open conversation in response to one another. As context for that, in the discussions that we've had over the last 3 days and in points that each of them raised, there are 5 categories of things that have come up for a role of a funder in this space. One is the support for basic research and in meta research, trying to just understand how the system is. A second is supporting the development and operation of infrastructure, tools, methodologies to advance new ways of doing research in the respective domains that those funders work. A third is in the policies that funders themselves adopt in their granting mechanisms, the procedures that they use. Fourth is supporting applied research, evaluating the effectiveness of those policies and the effectiveness of the tools, infrastructure, and basic research that's done. And then the fifth, that is more ambiguous in terms of how is it that funders play a role, is what is their role in the broader cultural social movement to try to improve research practices outside of their walls and granting making capacities? What role do they play? So just to help seed the conversation among them, perhaps it can start with Chonnettia's provocation, which is there's a lot that's come out. How is it that that gets translated? Where are the things that are innovations that are clearly actionable, the ones that clearly have gaps, the ones that have inspired innovations already that you haven't talked about but want to talk about? Yeah. But we'll just leave this to you guys to discuss for the next 20 to 30 minutes.
Yeah, so I guess I'll start off because one of the things that I've been doing over the last couple of days is really listening to just the variety of approaches that people are using to answer really important questions. And there's just some things that really struck me. I think one is the importance of technology. I mean, what we're able to do now with machine learning, big data approaches is really remarkable. I think that's really creating an exciting opportunity to be able to ask questions in a way we haven't been able to. I think the second thing for me is around really just this consciousness around this being a social enterprise. And as a funder, it makes me think, we can establish all of the policies that we want, we can put everything into the calls that we do and so forth. But at the end of the day, I think as a community, we respond in a way that's social. And it might be good to talk about what some of those, the implications of that might be. And I think the other thing is, I think just trying to get understanding of what other, from a funder perspective, how else can we help? How else can we support? I mean, yes, we can certainly bring some money to the table. But as I've said, I think for us to really get at and understand how research works, I think we have to appreciate that we're part of a system. And taking a systems approach, I think, to research, I think would be useful. How do we actually do that? What do we actually need to do in order to support that?
Yeah, this is great, by the way, so thank you for what you've said. I think a lot about when we're trying to promote change, and I mean like radical, I'm not a fan of incremental change. I think that we need sort of radical solutions, and we need to constantly challenge ourselves about just how to start from the foundations and rebuild it. Part of what we have is a lever. We have a social lever and we have a financial lever. And so, I'd be interested in advice from you guys about, where our lever is. So the ecosystem in which we exist now, let's talk about young people. For people my age, I think we can't really imagine the situation that young scholars are in. In many fields, there's been a continuing and massive growth in the production of PhDs. In many disciplines and at many places, the training is very rigorous, maybe better than it's ever been before. But the cultural belief that, yes, and then the normal course of events is you get a tenure-track job and you publish and you get grants and so forth. The rate of tenure-track jobs is not growing anywhere as near as fast as the growth in the rate of the production of PhDs. And so when I was young, if you went on the other track, no one said it to you and to your face typically, but the idea was, that's because you're second rate. You're taking the lesser road. And I just think that was never the right way to look at it. But now it's just a missed opportunity because the training in so many fields, there's more than one path to create value with the amazing things that you learn in graduate programs and postdocs. And so reorienting our funding, reorienting how we think about graduate students, not to think about how do we get publications, but how do we provide value? How can we create more lanes for people to take the amazing scientific corpus that we have and create more value for more people Like, I think that's a fundamental part of this enterprise. And if we think about metascience without understanding that ecosystem, I just think whatever advice we give is going to be discordant. Because if you're a young person and you're hearing this advice, it might sound great in the abstract. But somebody asked this question yesterday about I think it was your graduate student that never listens to you, about the conflict between his everyday existence and these lofty goals. If the existential crisis is this far from your nose, will I have a job tomorrow? Well, it is hard to hear the rest of this. But I think that what we can do as funders and what other organizations can do is think about these problems simultaneously. The purpose of metascience is not so that we can impress each other at cocktail parties, right? The purpose of metascience is that when we produce data, when we make claims, the people that act on them are actually going to be okay, right? That the information we provide is going to be actionable and that there's a decent chance that it's going to have the outcome that we said it did, right? So for me, when I think about what we're trying to do and how we're trying to play in this space, if we're not paying attention to the rapidly changing ecosystem, our goals don't matter that much. So I think that, the main thing we need to do is reconcile them.
And I'm really glad you said that, because what's not immediately obvious is that, some tasks are easy and some tasks are difficult. And I think in this sort of order of difficulty, it's relatively easy to spot that something's wrong. It's a bit more difficult to identify what's wrong, and then it's really difficult to find and implement the solution. And even just identifying what's wrong, it's very obvious with the funding rate being so low. There's all sorts of problems. But is the problem that there's not enough money? Is the problem that there are too many scientists? Is the problem that the process is imperfect? And if we go down the wrong route and we make some kind of really quick, rash decision, then, as you said, the new iteration might be much worse than what we're with now. And I think that requires a lot of thought, and I think that's probably something that will emerge out of this field. I think right now, what's becoming very clear in a very convincing way, and that's a good thing, that there are problems. We should be paying more attention to the problems. And I'm glad you're both spending lots of money on metascience, because you have a lot more of it. And so we spend a bit of money on metascience, but there's only so much we're going to do. So I think making a very convincing case that we can do better, and then finding some good empirical evidence to identify the problem, and then coming up with solutions that might be simple, they might be complex. One thing I'm always reminded of is, so I have a 1-year-old. He's great, and he messes up the whole house. But as parents, you realize that if the bath water is too hot, it could seriously burn the baby. And this is it's been a problem for a long time. And you can either have a big education plan and remind all parents to get the bath water temperature just right all the time, or you can pass some kind of law that means manufacturers have to make water heaters that can't go above a certain temperature. Those are both solutions to a problem. One of them is just much better and much more reliable. And I think those are the kinds of solutions that we would want to move towards, the low-hanging fruit. But we've got to do it very carefully. And someone else mentioned, I think yesterday, that this is a rare event that one would have scientists, publishers, and funders all in the same room. And I think we need more of that. I think that is just a fantastic way to start.
So I think two other things that, as I've been listening to both of you and thinking about some of the conversation last couple of days, I've also been reflecting on. One is on research culture, and the other is on making the case for meta-research. So let me expand a little bit on research culture. And it's something that I think at Wellcome we're thinking a lot about now. So it's extremely disappointing. I think we all felt this way. Excuse me, when we heard the difficulty for those trying to do the replication studies could not get access to reagents and tools and the methods. And some amazing thinking happening by the Center for Open Science and others to try to improve that. And I think as funders, we're also thinking about that. Even if we were to do that, it's still not, in my view, going to be enough to make people want to actually share things openly because of this competitiveness that we talked about. Now, there's tons of behaviors that are clearly underpinning this, and I think we need to be worried about that. So I think that's one thing is under research culture, there's this whole open access, open research movement for a purpose. And I understand that there are some unanticipated, consequences of doing it, and I understand the concerns, the arguments on both sides. But that has to be indicative of a problem that I imagine is only going to get worse if we don't actually deal with this. The whole concept of publish and or perish, really worrisome, again, from Wellcome perspective, that people are still relying on journal impact factor when we all know how flawed that is as a metric. That H indices, that we know how flawed, there's really strong research evidence, people have actually studying this, and yet we still are using it to make decisions. It's not, from Wellcome's perspective, we try really hard not to let that get into funding. But as someone pointed out, I think it was Paula earlier, we have no control over a reviewer who's sitting there with their laptop looking up H indices and what papers and whatever research they did at home to prepare for the panel. I think the other thing is the pressure that we're putting on our early career researchers that are manifesting in mental health conditions. How can we ignore this? And I think that's really the responsibility. When you're talking about holding us accountable, and I think funders are one actor in that, is how can we not act? And I think that's, again, an important role for meta research, is to be able to provide, as Dawid said, the information that helps understand what is the problem, the scale of it, the extent of it, how do we actually address it, and what are the effective means by which to actually change things? And we don't have the research evidence to do that. So what a funder does, independently of the hundreds of funders around the world, we try our best to do a little bit, and sometimes it helps and sometimes it doesn't. I think the last point I'll just say about making the case for meta research, when we've talked to funders for, like I said, over the last couple of years, and there was no doubt, and it was a pleasant surprise that many funders really believe in the value of meta research, Metascience. And the question that we wanted to ask of them, well, then why aren't we supporting it? Why aren't more of us actually funding it? And what I heard continuously from many of my colleagues, and I'll say Wellcome was not an exception, was that they were having difficulty making the case of the added value of doing it. Meaning, if a funder has to decide between giving away a 2 million, 3 million pound or dollar grant to an individual researcher to do research, would you take that away from being able to support someone to be able to fund a meta research study? Now, in principle, you would think, well, yes, absolutely, because what you'll gain out of a meta research study could completely transform the way that you're actually going to issue all of your funding. And that would benefit everybody, right? But when you're under budget pressures and you're talking about pay lines, and you've got people sitting at that pay line, do you take that money away from the next person that's below that pay line? And that's the challenge. And I think it's because, again, we don't have enough research evidence. We've not been able to demonstrate the value that can come through the insights generated through meta research to actually inform our practice.
I agree with that. And in terms of research agendas that we might suitably pursue, I want to ask us not to do one thing and then ask us to do a bunch of other things. So the one thing that I would we might do research on the truth value of the conjecture I'm about to make. I think for the next N years, where N is a single digit, we should waste no time at all trying to influence tenure and promotion committees. And the reason is because everyone they're related to is trying to do this now on every issue you can imagine, right? But there's a different way to influence incentives, right? And some of them aren't that hard. So I can't, we're blinded up here. There's all these lights. But is that David? Who's wearing the badges shirt? Yeah, can you stand up for a sec? All right, so these open science badges, if you don't know about them, they are, let's see. Thank you. Yeah, so the concept behind an open science badge, if you don't know about it, is if you remember in the second grade, you get a math test and you get a good grade on it and they put a gold star in it. You bring it home to your mom and your mom puts it on the refrigerator and all the relatives see it and it's amazing. And the gold stars, you can go to Walgreens and buy them 39 for $1, 100 of them for 39 cents. They cost nothing to produce, but they create this incentive ecosystem and this great joy. The badges are genius, right? I don't know how much you paid the graphic artist, right? But they cost nothing to produce. The marginal cost afterwards is basically zero. But journals can sign up for them, and you guys have run studies. I know that there's been a distribution of the outcomes, but the idea is this is an incentive that costs very little to produce and can create an ecosystem where people want the badges attached to their publications. If you don't know how they work, a journal can sign on to these, and then next to the line where your name and the title and the abstract, you can have badges if you have open data and pre-registration and things of that nature. And you may think these things don't matter, but in a culture where people are trying to establish themselves as reliable, credible purveyors of some sort of knowledge, sometimes these indicators matter. And we can test whether they're better or worse than H indices. So that really matters. There are other things we can do too. There's a movement to cite data. And if we have persistent ID identifiers for data linked with a data citation system, that can become a currency. Right? Now, we don't have to talk to a tenure and promotion committee about that. If data becomes something that's cited, we might not like citation counts, but maybe we're making the citation counts that at least for a while they're all going to use a little less worse. And I'll give you one other example. Sexual harassment is a huge issue in science. What we did at NSF, we had really visionary leadership. Instead of waiting to be told what to do, NSF brought together a lot of stakeholders, listened to a lot of people about what the problems were, and put out their own sexual harassment policy. Because we had a lever, and the lever was, if you'd like funding from us, and the proposal is not to investigators, it's to universities. If you want funding from us, here's a set of procedures that you must follow, right, to create an inclusive and safe workplace. Yeah. When we did that, I was visiting universities in the week after. I think every university in the country was scrambling who didn't have a good sexual harassment policy to do that. So again, this is an area where those of us who have levers can do something. If you read our sexual harassment policy, it's very powerful, but conceptually it's very straightforward. So it's a rather limited effort that has a huge impact, right? So again, I would urge us in terms of strategy, think about what we can do, and in terms of research, let's think about things that we can actually do and collect data and evidence on whether and how they would work.
Yeah, and I smiled when you talked about the idea of citing data, because I wouldn't have thought of that. And I think sometimes some of the best solutions that will come out will be creative ones that people just haven't really thought of. But I want to say something about accountability, being from a Templeton Foundation. We can kind of use lots of leverage in what we do, but I'm accountable to trustees who are scientists, and they want to do good science. So even for people like myself, my job depends on listening to scientists and being very careful with what I do. If you run a PCR machine or do HPLC or something and you drop your agent or you break the machine, then that's a $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 mistake. If I write the wrong text in an application form or in a policy document, that could ruin a lot of good work. And because of that, and I'm sure others would also quite reasonably be cautious of just changing things. I mean, the sexual harassment policy, I think, is a great example of getting things right, and it demonstrates how powerful a change can be if you get things right. If that was done in the wrong way, or it went in another direction, it could be a real disaster. And I think that's just another reason why I think this kind of partnership is so important, so that we base our decisions on real evidence, and that we take our time to get it right before we make changes.
So I'm glad you brought up the sexual harassment policy, because I think it's so important, and it does speak to culture. And Wellcome, we did something similar, and we were inspired by what the NSF did. But I think there was a question yesterday around, when, or maybe comment discussions around, when should funders kind of do that top-down mandate? And when is it not appropriate for us to do that? When should we be much more inclusive and consultative? And I have to say, I've been in funding for 10 years now. No funder takes that decision lightly. I think we are extremely reluctant to do any type of top-down mandate. And so a lot of thought and discussion goes into anything. So that's true of sexual harassment. It's true of open access, which is a live conversation in the UK right now, in Europe, and so forth. It's true about open, data and making research outputs. It's true about the journal impact factor and DORA and so forth. And I've been privy to be in organizations that have really been at the forefront and leading some of those discussions. But I can tell you it's not a fun day at work. We go through some really rigorous debate for a lot of the same reasons. We have scientists on our board, and we have scientists in the organization. I'm a scientist by training, so I get both sides of the argument, preserving academic freedom and independence, et cetera, how research actually works, and then coming down with something that could potentially really impact an individual or an institution. That's really, really, really difficult. And I think it goes back to what we were saying is in terms of what the role of funders have. In a way, I think we just have to constantly remind ourselves, what is our purpose? And while, being consultative and having discussions with the community has its place and purpose, there's sometimes I think where we kind of really need to stick our head up and risk kind of being kind of really criticized for taking some of those positions because we think it's in the best interest of the public good. It's in the best interest of the community. And it's really, really difficult to do that. So again, I would welcome some discussion or advice on how do you do it well. We don't get it right all the time, of course. But again, that's a place for meta research. Would love to know whether our policies, sexual harassment, open access, et cetera, are actually working. Or are they creating perverse behaviors or other types of responses that we hadn't intended? And that's what I mean by evidence, having the appropriate evidence to know how can we do what we do better.
I can't do better than that.
All right. So thank you for that great discussion. So we have time for more dialogue between you and these members. So please feel free to come up to the microphone and ask the questions that you want to ask, and we'll see which ones they want to answer. So please, Sarah.
We should have kept talking for a little bit longer, I think.
And given the number of you, they should all be multiple choice questions.
And now's the time to pitch your funding idea. We'll just be so grateful to not be criticized.
I do have some ideas. I'd love to get funded. I'll run by you. So my name's Sarah Hart. I'm in psychology at Florida State University. And I wanted to kind of respond to what you just said, actually, kind of what can funders do. I somehow convinced NIH to give me an R01 to build a data repository to store data for my field. So I had to kind of nest it within scientific questions for everybody to kind of, buy in. But, we're in our first year of 5 years. And it would be so helpful thinking about top-down things that agencies can do. I'm out there working my field, so I'm in education. I'm trying to convince educational researchers and developmental psychologists to give us their data. We're building this data repository, but now we want people to give us their data, and we're kind of focused on people who mostly have IES funding in the US. And they all have, data sharing plans that they had to write while they were submitting their grants, but there's almost no top-down pressure to support them actually doing those plans. And so it was helpful, I think, in the US when NIH and then the other funders kind of forced papers to be open access after a year. And that really heavy top-down pressure did make an entire change to the field. And I would love to see top-down pressure about the data management plans. And, you said you were going to release these data. These data do belong to the public. At the very least, they belong to your university, not the investigator. To that, I would love to see kind of people say, no, for realsies, we're going to hold you to these plans. And here are these wonderful places that you can store your data that will be, stored properly and indefinitely. and not just die on your computer.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I will say that Wellcome just published our first outputs management plan. We call it outputs because obviously we think the range of research outputs are important. And you're absolutely right. That's a really good example. So based on evidence, so us in a small team, I have a small team of about 20 people, and we wanted to understand, okay, well, can we actually find out the outputs of the research that we actually fund? And with all of the best reporting practices, and we all know about reporting bias, we found that actually we couldn't find data sets, software, et cetera. And that was really worrisome. And what we decided to do in response to that was, well, clearly we need to implement a stronger policy. So we have an outputs management plan. And what that means is at the start of a grant application, if the expectation of the research is to generate significant database software, what have you, we make that explicit that we want to know what their plan is for how they will actually sustain that, how they will make their outputs available, and we want all of that open. That is now part of the review process. So that's important, that's good, it's explicit. But now we also have a means by which to actually review that and to make sure that they've actually complied with that. Now the challenge with that is for those kind of large databases, tools, and so forth, you can reasonably do that. But for those of us who are pursuing research and you weren't expecting, for example, to produce maybe that transgenic line or that database, we hope that you're going to do the same thing. Through the course of your research, you realize that. But will we know about it? Will anybody be able to find it? Will people share it if they ask for it? So the other thing that we're interested in doing is investing in the development of new software, fairware, to be able to ensure that all research outputs, whether we've mandated it or any other funders mandated, that we can actually find it, it's accessible, it's interoperable, and it's reusable. That's not a trivial thing to do. So I absolutely agree with you. It's so hugely important, and that's an example of, I think, as a funder, I think we realize as much as we've been talking about making research data available for 20 years, at some point you're like, oh gosh, we're going to have to do more because it's just not happening. So yeah, I appreciate your comments. I think that's exactly right.
I think I have some good news for you.
Okay.
So the fact that the publications are available, the focal point there was what's called the Holdren memo. It came out in 2013. John Holdren was the head of Office of Science and Technology Policy and said that the federal agencies that did more than $100 million of research funding a year had to do this. I'm now on the subcommittee for open science for OSTP. And if you watch television or you're on social media, you may be led to believe that nothing gets done in Washington and that the two main parties disagree on everything. That's wrong. And one thing where we've got tailwinds from every part of the government is on making data available. So what we are talking about right now, I'll tell you about NSF, we want to make DMPs reportable. So today we don't have our reviewing software doesn't have that. So many of our programs require data management plans. And when you send in an annual or final report, they're checked. But right now what the program officer has to do is go find your DMP, and then they have to check it with your annual report. We want to put it into a single workflow. And that is an active conversation that we're having because it's not, we need to build out the new version of the PAR. And I can't say officially whether that's going to happen. But the other thing is we've been talking with all of the other agencies about machine readability and versioning, right? Because that, you don't think of it versioning with a data management plan, but the reality is, and we've heard it for the last couple of days, you start out with a DMP and then reality hits, and then you might want to change what you're doing. Versioning of DMPs shouldn't be a bad thing. You say, well, at the time when I was going to do this, and then you write in, look, we discovered something, and here's why we decided to change it. So it's like pre-registration, where you pre-register, and then you say, okay, we had planned to do this, but then you can be honest about it, right? I mean, the key is honesty, right? Like, then this thing happened, and so now we're going to do it this other way, but we're not going to pretend that it's pre-registered. So these are things we're working towards. These are conversations we're having across agencies, and these are things where both the White House and Congress are giving us signals to do this. So, I hope within a very short period of time that we have better abilities to support what you're doing, and thank you for what you're doing, by the way.
Thank you.
So I kind of tended to ask, controversial questions, and once I was told I'm cynical. So it's time to kind of compensate for that, to saying some things. And I will start with mentioning what Chonnettia said about this imposed impact factor that we still follow and citation numbers that we follow, and what Arthur said about badges, that if badges would be placed, say in an article saying, this is a better article than another one, confirmed versus not confirmed, contradicted, perhaps the same with researchers. And it happens that some time ago, my collaborators and our co-founders and I had the same exact ideas. We thought, what if we are able to take, to make it such that if I take a paper from a neighboring field I don't know about, it'll be a badge there that would say, look, this paper was cited 1,000 times, but 10 citations confirming it and 5 citations contradicting it. And you can get quick access to those papers, can read them and decide for yourself what actually the deal is. And the same eventually you can do with research. You look at the researcher and its keynote address and this and that and this and that, but you can find that most of the studies this research group publishes are confirmed. Or you can find something a bit different. And for that you need to take advantage of this new technology, machine learning, deep learning, and so on. And we had some finding from private investors a little bit that allowed us to build something. And then, as like a long Hail Mary shot, we just decided, look, those NSF guys say that they found something that is like, it has to be almost impossible to do, but not completely impossible. And if you're a small business, you can do it. And we just took and applied. And we practically forgot about it because it was so Hail Mary tough. And then we get a call from a program director who says, look, this is very important. He was asking, can we extend it to the fake news problem? It was very clear that he cared about the problem. He even asked, me if, what we do aligns with my inner self, which I had to dig inside and, literally 24 other questions and writing. And we got the grant. And we got the grant, and, I'm here because of this grant. It funds, my trip here as well. And not only the money that allows us to work, what it gives us this credibility, because then as I said with the award, what became a notice, you not only if you want to use this sign of the NSF, here's the link to the logo, download it, put it elsewhere, it's on our poster over here, and it gave us the credibility. So not the question. I want to thank. This is my thanks. Right?
Okay. So wrap it up, please, so we can get to others.
Because you need something positive, right? So the thing is, and then thanks to that, when we start to approach journals, including quite big journals, to put those badges on journals, we now have agreements with them, and they will be coming quite soon. So look for your papers. They'll have all the supporting evidence right in front of them. Thank you so much. And, it's a sign of optimism from a cynic, and this is why it took so much time to explain it. Thank you.
Hi, Steve Goodman from Stanford. So I'll make just one comment and then a very specific funding request. Now I'm talking. So I've been at PCORI now since its inception, and we just finally, after starting the push for an open science policy at its inception, I think in 2011, it just was rolled out last year. And what's interesting about it is not just that it requires open data sharing with very specific desiderata, but that it says it will fund it. That is, it will add extra funds to prepare the data. Now, this was a huge issue internally because we tried to make an estimate of how much that would be, and the initial number that was tossed out was 10%, which scared the bejesus out of everybody because that meant, as Chonnettia was saying, 10% less grants. And could we justify that? In the end, I think it will be far, far less than that, partly because what you're funding through that is practices that people should be doing anyway. I mean, they should be able to go back 6 months later and identify the data set, not just for somebody else, but for themselves. So it was very, very difficult to think about what the incremental cost really should be over and above just good data, management and good data science. But in the end, they are going to pay for it. And this is critical. That makes it not just an unfunded mandate. But in this spirit, I want to sort of challenge the really important point that Chonnettia brought up, which was on the value proposition. We don't force basic scientists, which all of you fund, to present a value proposition for finding this receptor. You know, we don't make, because we understand the importance of fundamental science. We don't say that, well, I'm sorry, we can't fund mechanism because we don't know if in 2 years it's going to result in a drug. We understand the mechanism of science enough so we understand that the basic science, to an extent, will have long-term payoff, and we don't quite know what that long-term payoff is. So I would say some of the same thing is true about a lot of meta-research. That is, we don't know. We should be testing all along the way, just like we do with basic research all along the developmental and translational pipeline. But we don't know, in the end, exactly what the payoff is going to be. But it's really hard to imagine that a system where people can find their own data in analyzable form, no less other people, and all the other elements of open science and meta-research, that won't have a positive benefit. And I do think there has to be, to some extent, a leap of faith here, that this is the basic science of science, and that you should demand no more of this than you demand of basic research in biomedical and other sciences. So that's my statement. And Corey had enough faith in that to actually put that money behind it. Here's the specific funding request. And it's only, so we're starting an office here for the first time at Stanford, specifically in this space, not responsible conduct of research or research integrity, but to improve these practices. And one of the things I propose for this, because I think the army of motivation and insight is so powerful, is the young researchers, is to give young researchers in their own field small amounts of money, 20,000, 40,000, 50,000, to improve something in their own processes that they could spread to their own department, to their own lab, because they have the deepest insight. As Chonnettia was saying, you know, they're under huge pressure, but they're also incredibly motivated. And the only way they can affect their own science right now is, you know, publishing that Cell paper, publishing that Science paper. But they almost all have a lot of knowledge about how to improve their own their own processes. If we could give, you know, if funders could fund either centrally through offices that would then disperse them, or directly to young researchers who had really good ideas, and actually we just heard one right before me, to improve their own science with small amounts. This would be like tinder, you know, this would be like in a fire. It could ignite the big oaks and set the whole forest aflame. Yeah. So that's the specific idea I would have, is to make small amounts of money available to a large number of not just meta-researchers, but turn existing scientists into meta-researchers in their own field.
Yeah. So thank you, Steve, for that. I completely agree. I think both of your points, the value of, you know, meta-research in of itself to understand the process, and then building the capacity. And I completely agree with that. The consortium that I mentioned that we're launching at the end of the month, of which we've got multiple funders who are involved in this is exactly two of the things that we want to be able to do with that. One is to really help define what those questions are. The only thing I would say is, could we move beyond, for example, asking questions that might be somewhat limited in terms of their scope? Can we come up with a set of research questions that might be shared or applicable across multiple different areas of research? That's one way of prioritizing or focus. So investing in the research that you're talking about so it can benefit a multitude of groups. And the other thing is to build that practice and build that capability and develop that capacity with our new generation of researchers that are coming through. And that doesn't take very much money. We do know that. But I think what I'm hoping is that over the next 2 years in a pilot, that one of the things that we'll do is demonstrating the value of what you're saying. You know, I don't know about you, but this is the first time I've really have been to a meeting like this on this scale. And I don't think most people really know what all of you are doing. Certainly not a lot of funders that I know I've talked to. We need to work with you to increase the visibility and really demonstrate the value of what I think this field could bring. So that's where I'm focused. I completely align with you on that. Thank you.
Thanks. I don't know if anybody else wants to comment.
Do you want to go? I could, but you haven't spoken.
I was just going to say Tinder of Metascience sounds like a great match.
Yeah, that was an unfortunate metaphor. I'm sorry. I didn't.
It's-
I meant like
it's-
little twigs that light on fire.
It's good, and it sounds like what you're proposing isn't just...
Kindling. Oh, yeah. It's kindling is what I meant, not Tinder.
It sounds like it's not just there about the research, but empowering people at the sort of grassroots level to make things better. I think that is a really great idea. One possibility would be to turn it around as researchers and get data from large groups of PhD students who just want to identify problems and say this is wrong or that's wrong. But overall, I think that's a really great idea.
Well, just very quickly, because I want to let other people ask questions. If you come to NSF, we have a fundamental obligation to the taxpayers. And so the two things that we really need in grant proposals are not just the scientific merit, but the broader impacts. And the broader impacts can't be a paragraph tacked on at the end. There are an infinite number of scientific studies that could be proposed, and we can fund a small subset of those, even in the best case. And so even if you're doing basic research, in this area, what's essential is that you be able to have two sentences at the end. And the sentence is, if by chance we discover this thing that's possible, then people will be empowered to do a different thing. And because they can do that thing, people's lives might be transformed. If you can build the rest of that bridge, we can defend you.
Paul Glasgow, clinical epidemiologist from Bond University in Australia. I wanted to pick up on Steve's point about the value proposition, though I don't have a specific funding pitch like he did. Apologise. I actually wanted to pick up on Chonnettia's point of the difficulty of getting research on research funded as a specific stream by researchers, and congratulations that Wellcome is actually doing it. I think that's great, but very few funders actually do this and are very resistant to it. But it seems the value proposition is very much there. The Lancet series on waste in research calculated that because of avoidable flaws, non-publication, and poor reporting of research, that 85% of research goes to waste. That's over $100 billion a year that is potentially salvageable if we could fix the problem. Is the problem fixable? Well, it needs meta-research to do that, research on research. But to give you, I'm not pitching this idea, by the way, but this is just one example of what could be done. The UK's Health Technology Assessment Program gets 98% of its clinical trials reported completely, compared with the world average of 50%. It's an extreme outlier. And what it does is it monitors the trials as they're going on, and it withholds 10% of the funding until the trial is actually reported. Not the final report coming in, but the trial actually has to be published before they'll give the last 10% of funding. You could randomise funders to do a similar program to that, or different styles of program, to see whether other funders could achieve that same impact. And that would salvage tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in clinical trial investment that's currently going to waste for a very small investment. So the return on investment proposition here for doing particularly applied meta-research, I think, is amazing. But I think we do need a portfolio of basic meta-research, applied meta-research, and translational meta-research. And most of the funders that are funding this at the moment, and it's very few, are doing only one small stream, very tiny components.
Yep. So just a couple of reactions to what you said. I absolutely agree. I think the case for clinical research is, and the value proposition for that makes a lot of sense, right? Because you can see the direct impact to individuals, people's lives, people's health. I think it's a lot more difficult to do that when you're talking about, for example, just the conduct of research enterprise. What is the impact? We're talking about excellence, talking about the number of scientists we're trying to support, when we've already acknowledged that, there's many more new scientists coming into, the research enterprise for which there aren't jobs. So it's hard to articulate what that outcome is. So I think that's the problem. It's not that absolutely welcome. I think we believe there is a value proposition, but we don't have the evidence to be able to demonstrate that. Now that gets to the point I'm making about the applied and translational aspect. It's not that I think that it's more important than the basic meta research. It's that in the absence of that, we don't know what to do about it. So the reaction to the Lancet series on waste was amazing. Immediately after that report, I was invited to cross-sector meetings in the UK to talk about, this is really bad. What can we do? And I sat in a workshop for a half a day with funders and publishers and academics and researchers, et cetera, and professional societies. And we all said, we don't actually know how bad the problem is. We don't know where it starts, and we don't know what to do about it. So I think it's great that there's now that awareness that the same thing is true of replication research, but it's difficult to say, how do we respond to that? So that's my proposition, and that's why Wellcome is initiating this consortium with other funders, because what we did over the last 2 years to say, imagine if we were funders were seen not as just funding research, I think there's a role for us to do that, but we are treated as end users or collaborators in the same way that you approach patients or clinicians or publics about informing research design and prioritization and so forth to maximize the likelihood that the insights from that study can actually have potential to drive change. And that's all I'm suggesting is seeing funders in a separate role because we have the data. And it's not publicly available. And we have experience of funding. We understand how it works. And we can bring all of that to the table in the same way that you would ask your colleague that you're entering into a research collaboration who's bringing a specific expertise, we have expertise too. And so all I'm suggesting is that just that little bit of that mindset could do exactly what I think you're saying and really transform it. And that's what we're focusing on with the consortium the 2 years is because we've been able to, and it didn't take very long to get 15 funders. There's, like I said, 10 countries, almost every continent imaginable involved because we all recognize this is a problem and we all recognize that we need to be part of the solution. So I completely agree with you. I think we need both, but I think I'm like Skip, I'm interested about transformation to some extent. How can we really move from what's happening now and really bring about something potentially transformative? And I think that's what we need to do. And I'm saying this from Wellcome as a funder, challenging my peers, my colleagues at other funding agencies. It's not just us. There's publishers, there's professional societies, there's organizations. Somebody needs to step up and say, look, we need to participate in a way we've never done before. We need to invest in it. We need to participate in it. We need to make a commitment to action those insights. Because if that research evidence tells us there is a better way of doing things, how can we not take that responsibly or seriously?
Hi, my name is Luke Rinnie. I'm a researcher in developmental psychology and the learning sciences. I'm on the more junior end of the spectrum, somewhat in contrast to a lot of the wonderful folks here who have these excellent tenure track and tenured jobs. One thing that I have had as an experience as a younger scientist is that, and this is a problem that's been pointed out by a number of people at this conference, is that you kind of have to have grant funding to get a tenure track position, but then you cannot also get funding unless you are tenure track faculty. I'm not sure whether this is true. I've been told that this isn't necessarily true in the medical sciences. But in the field that I work in and in the social sciences in general, my experience has been that universities themselves do not allow people who are not tenure track faculty or have full-time independent positions to apply for grant funding. They won't allow them to be PIs or even co-PIs on grant applications. And when I've spoken to the people in grants offices and things like this, they've told me in somewhat coded language that the reason that this norm has emerged is twofold. Number one, they don't want a postdoc or something like that to get a grant, however small, and then leave the university and take that money somewhere else when they use their grant to get a job. The second thing that I've been told, again in somewhat coded language, is that the other professors at the other faculty at the university don't want people who are working alongside them at their same university to be competing against them for these very scant number of grants that are out there. So while I am very appreciative of the rhetoric around all of these things about young scientists smashing the foundations and remaking them and so forth, and I feel like everyone has very clearly recognized the problem of there being too many PhDs. There's been a wonderful recommendation yesterday about maybe tenured faculty who are PIs on grants. Maybe the university shouldn't receive F&A or indirect costs or something like that for those individuals in order to promote the creation of more full-time positions. One suggestion that I have, and I don't really know whether it's feasible, is it possible for some granting agencies such as yourselves to use the levers that you have at your disposal to actually push universities to democratize somewhat access to these grants by perhaps compelling them to open their granting offices to be willing to help more junior researchers, postdocs, et cetera, to actually be able to apply for grants. I don't know how feasible that is, but I think it would go a long way toward allowing some of these younger folks to sort of get started instead of just being stuck in this vicious cycle of not having funding and needing funding to get a job and then not being able to get a job. So anyway, that's just a general suggestion.
I'll just say really quickly that we've done that before quite a number of times, given grants to people who are very junior postdocs and so on, and I haven't had any problems. But I don't know. I mean, you've given more.
Just to clarify, I want to make clear that these are the policies of universities. I'm not saying these are your policies. Yeah.
Well, I've never heard of any of these applicants running into trouble with those policies and asking me to say so. I mean, they may have just said, well, the foundation invited me to apply or something like that.
And I would suggest that is likely because those individuals haven't been allowed to apply by their grants offices through whom all applications have to run. Anyway, just a thought.
If I may, I agree with Dawid on the main point. I don't think there are too many PhDs. I think that the knowledge, the deep dives that you do in graduate training are essentially valuable to so many enterprises. The problem is we only train people to go into academic pipelines, and the things that you learn in graduate programs can be used in so many different areas that we need to be a lot better at training, at giving people the materials they need to have an influence everywhere. I mean, graduate schools train people in really important insights. I think we need more of that, not less.
Let me invite those that are still standing in line to come up and block the exits here so we can ask the questions of the panel members in informal time. We are over our time, and so I want to transition into break so people have chance for informal discussion. But this was a fantastic introduction and discussion from these members, so let's please thank them for these contributions.